Bonjour à tous. Good afternoon for those of you who are in Europe. Good morning to those of you who are following us in America. Good morning, Kevin. Nice to have you with us. And welcome to the conference of Paris for those who are just joining us live now. Today I have the pleasure to have this conversation with Kevin Sneader. Kevin Sneader, as you well know, is the global managing partner at McKinsey and Company, a very famous consulting firm with almost a century of existence, a company with over 30,000 colleagues spread in over 130 cities in the world. Kevin, I haven't checked how far was the Scottish accent of James McKinsey, the founder of your company, but what I know is that your Scottish accent is quite clear. You were raised in Glasgow, Scotland. You began your studies in Glasgow, then you moved to Harvard Business School. You joined McKinsey over 30 years ago, so that's quite a long time. I'm not going to cover your whole career. People can check this on the website. What I can tell, among other things, is that you spent some time in China, and now you lead this amazing company. Today, you are in New York. You should have been with us here in Paris for the Paris conference. I'm based in Paris, and the reason why we are not together for real is, as you all know, a tiny virus, which is really disturbing our daily lives here in Europe or in America or in Asia, in Africa, everywhere in the world, which is hurting businesses badly, big businesses as well as small businesses. And this is what we are going to talk about. And I guess our audience from Europe, America, or elsewhere is quite eager to hear from you what lessons you have already drawn from this pandemic, from the first wave at least, and maybe our audience is eager to hear some advice, as they are either government people or business leaders. So to begin with, Kevin, I wanted to stick to the hot news. I'm a journalist, sorry. As you all know, you heard yesterday an amazing announcement from Pfizer company about a vaccine that they claim is efficient at a 90% rate. The financial markets went crazy yesterday all over the world. In Paris, the Paris index CAC 40 went up 7.5% in one day. Now, Kevin, you're neither a doctor or an infectious disease specialist, but I know your teams have researched about the issue of a vaccine. What does what happened yesterday tell us about what we are living through? This crazy, or at least that's what I think, this crazy reaction of the financial markets. What does it tell about the situation? And maybe then can we elaborate about what's at stake with the vaccines?
Well, Fabrice, good morning, and thank you very much indeed for making my mother proud. She would have loved that introduction. The vaccine represents light at the end of the tunnel. In this enormous humanitarian challenge where there's always been two objectives, to save lives and safeguard livelihoods, there's now a path that appears much more promising on the saving lives. And if you think about what's really been disturbing the markets or business confidence or day-to-day life, it's this lack of certainty, this lack of confidence as to when this pandemic will end. And I think what happened yesterday is we saw a sense of, okay, a lot of us had been talking about we will likely have something by the end of 2021. Now what's happened is the degree of confidence around having something, namely a health solution, has gone up dramatically. And that's why the adjectives that were used yesterday about extraordinary, a once-in-a-century healthcare breakthrough, they all have some merit because of the scale of what this now promises. So in some ways, yesterday wasn't new news. I think a lot of people had published Q3 2021 as being a sort of date when we might expect that healthcare will have broken through. But what happened yesterday gave us much more confidence around that date. And of course, the big surprise was the degree of efficacy of this trial, over 90%. We had some optimistic scenarios. They were in the zone of 70%. So that in and of itself, that number, that 90%, I think has also been seen as somewhat extraordinary. It puts this vaccine in the same ranks as smallpox and some of the other diseases that have been eradicated. That's quite a thought when you think about where we are today.
Has your company researched the challenges on vaccine? One thing is to produce, to create a vaccine. The other is then to distribute it, to bring it to all the people who need it. And this is an amazing economic, financial, and logistical challenge. Do you have any insight about this?
Well, there are many challenges. The journey is not complete. Distribution and storage, minus 70 degrees Celsius, minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not straightforward, but again, the work is being done. The other part of this, of course, is to ask people their willingness to take a vaccine. In some ways, it's a surprise that this is such an issue, but it is. If I just take the United States, back in March, April, May, over 70% of those surveyed said they would take the vaccine. The number today, around 50%. I think in France, the number's around 59%. In China, it's 97%. In the UK, it's in the 80s. So part of the challenge is also, will people take the vaccine? And then let's remember, it requires 2 shots. This is not a 1 shot, it takes 2 shots. So we also need to make sure that the booster, the second shot, is given. So we have to also ensure that the protocol around the vaccine is followed. And last but by no means least, and this is where I think there will be a lot of attention, how do you decide who gets the vaccine? At one level, countries obviously are now allocating or trying to get hold of access to the vaccine. That's part of it. The other part of it, of course, is, do the elderly get it first because they're most impacted? Or is the desire to stop the spread and get to herd immunity quickest, in which case you might actually give it to the young, who are the primary spreaders? So this is why there's a lot of complexity, which isn't just the science, but let's be clear, the science was the major starting point for this. There is no discussion on distribution or how one chooses to allocate the supply of the vaccine while it's still scarce, because that only comes because of this remarkable scientific breakthrough.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. So we have been living through this historical crisis for over 6 months now worldwide. Your company, McKinsey, has made a lot of research on the way businesses have transformed sometimes, or at least tried to adapt to this situation. And you have already drawn some lessons about this pandemic. These lessons touch upon digitization, home working, or globalization. Let's start with digitization. Do you have the sense that we are really at a tipping point in the way companies globally are tackling technology?
Yes, I mean, it's worth remembering that this is about accelerating as well as new trends and forces. The acceleration in digitization is really around how consumers have been using digital. And so we've certainly seen in the area of digital retail, the numbers are quite striking. We're seeing that the rate of usage of digital retail is up 200%. The acceleration, we've seen 5 years in 5 months. I mean, the phrases are appropriate because there really has been this significant step towards the use of digital in the consumer application, the apps, shopping, the things that we're all experiencing. But actually, the piece which in many ways deserves even more recognition is what is happening in the business-to-business part of the digital landscape. The use of technology has often been heralded. We had phrases like the Internet of Things and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. These were big phrases about business would make its processes digitized. Automation would occur. That's now happening. That's being accelerated. And that's the part that in many ways is most impacted. Because as businesses have had to figure out new ways to make and source and deliver product, they've found new ways to automate and increase the rate at which they're able to use technology. And that part of the equation is why some of the discussion we were having a year or so ago about the future of work, reskilling, making people able to be productive in an environment where we're using machinery more, we're using automation, we're digitizing processes, that discussion is more urgent because I think we are going to see that the business-to-business part of the digitization, the automation of work, has been accelerated quite materially. And as a result, we need to think about how do we reskill people to cope with that technology shift. So digitization is definitely one of the biggest trends, both in terms of how consumers are using technology, but perhaps even more so how business is using technology.
Do you see a risk of seeing some countries or some specific industries really left behind in this trend, in this transformation?
Well, I think in any transformation, there is a number of risks. In the case of digitization, of course, the first risk is the digital divide between the haves and the have-nots, those who have access to high-speed broadband and with it the capacity to actually cope with the scale of data transfer that needs to occur for the kind of online activity to occur at a rate that's competitive. There's a risk that countries indeed will lose out, and there's a risk of greater inequality both between countries, because some countries have greater access. Think about the so-called developing world versus the developed world. And then within geographies, access at the local level is very different in rural parts of the country versus urban areas. But let's also remember there is a digital divide in terms of income. If you think about the way in which schools have been shut, and we've done work looking at the impact of education, remote education, at a time when people cannot send their kids to school, we know that disproportionately impacts those who only have limited access to a computer at home. And that is a big issue. So there is a risk. There's a risk of a digital divide. And it's important to understand that the promise of digital is a very positive one, that we can enable people to work on a more flexible basis, that we can address some of the inequalities of gender by making it more possible for people to choose the hours that they work. And we know that's a big factor. But there is this real issue of the digital divide. And it does mean that both companies, countries have got to look hard at the provision of digital infrastructure and make sure that they're not going to end up in a place where that divide grows much larger.
When we talk about digitization, we can move to home working or distance working. From the different surveys McKinsey conducted, do you have the feeling that home working is going to become the new normal?
I think it'll be part of the next normal, the new normal. I think there's an interesting fight going on as to whether we're going to be remote working or back at the office. I think that's misplaced. It will be a part, because I do think that people value the flexibility. They value the ability as to where they work and when they work. But let's remember, there is also another side of it. For a lot of people, home working, and I join a lot of video conferences like this, and I look and you can see a bed in the back of the video conference. Somebody's working in their bedroom. For a lot of people, the difference between remote working and what they had at the office is now they're sleeping at the office. They're sleeping at the office in their bedroom on a conference all day, and then they go to bed. That is sleeping at the office. That is not a good thing. And so I think the desire for humans to be together, for community, for creative problem solving, for working on issues, that will remain. So what I suspect will happen is that we will end up with a better balance between working from a home location or working from an office. The other point to remember, which we sometimes forget, is that only 40% of jobs can be done at home. A lot of people need to go somewhere to do their work. 40 cannot. 40, because the reality is it's not an option for the majority of the workforce. They need to go to a retail store if they work in retail. They need to go to a manufacturing facility if they work in manufacturing. They can't do that from home. So I believe that it's also important that we understand the conversation we have sometimes on remote working is a privileged one. It doesn't apply to everybody. And therefore, we need to be a bit more balanced in saying it's all going to be remote or it's all going to be in the office. It's going to be balanced, and it will only apply to some.
Just to share a personal story, just this morning, my wife's computer provided by her company just crashed. So home working is not always fun, even when you're privileged enough to be able to do it. Yeah. Kevin, talking about all these transformation that global business is experiencing under this crisis, I wanted to move to nearshoring. There has been a lot of talk about nearshoring, a brand new world where we would produce near home, buy some components from next door. Is this something, a real trend? Is this something that could become reality? Or what's your insight on this?
I think, again, the reality is not quite at the level of the headline. There is indeed a bigger issue, which is around the resilience of supply chains, which is underpinned. There's two issues that people talk about in this topic. One is resilience. One is actually geopolitics, the relationship between countries and where things get made. And I think it's important to keep both in perspective. What in many cases has happened is that manufacturing, we've discovered the importance of having a better relationship between just-in-time, low-cost, highly efficient sourcing of goods and moving of goods around the world, and the importance of reliability or resilience and being able to maintain production and supply of goods. I think in the context of that, there has and there will be a shift. People will be more cautious about relying on only one source for a particular component or part, if that is a particularly important component when it comes to making an important piece of equipment. So there will be a rebalancing for that reason, and I think we're seeing some of that. People are being more thoughtful. We did some work that said there are traded goods where you've got one country accounting for over 70% of the supply of that good. We saw that, for example, in some ventilators, some of the equipment that was needed during this pandemic. That's going to be rebalanced. I think that's just good common sense around how you manufacture and source. The notion that everybody's going to move every supply chain back to their home country is not going to happen. Because it doesn't make sense. It actually increases risk. It doesn't reduce risk. You then have concentration risk, everything in one place. And think about the vaccine development. BioNTech's a German firm. Pfizer's an American firm. The research was moving around the world. The distribution issues are going to be tackled globally. That's an example of where international collaboration still is really important. And so as a result, I think we overstate the extent to which people are going to want to reshore. But is it a trend? Yes. And what I think we'll actually see is regionalization. I do think, and we are already seeing a greater emphasis on production within regions for regions. So that's already occurring in Asia. Frankly, it's already occurring in the European Union, and it will occur in the Americas too. So I think rather than thinking we're going to see this massive everything being moved around the world, there will be a rebalancing. There are goods that single source does increase risk. People will address that. And there is a greater regional trade component because of the trading blocks and the other ways in which trade has already been developing. And again, the pandemic will accelerate that. But the notion that everything will be reshored, nearshored, offshored, no, I think it's going to be much more balanced than that.
You know China very well. How is this trend of reshoring going to affect China, which was dubbed the factory of the world?
Well, I think that's overstated for several reasons, not least of which is the Chinese economy is enormous and the domestic economy is enormous. Therefore, much of what China does actually stays at home. If you look at China and the United States, because of their absolute size, they do export in volume terms a lot of goods. But in proportion of their country's domestic products or capability of manufacturing, we're talking mid to high single digits. That's it. In other words, over 90% of what they need is for their domestic market. So most of what is made in China is made in China for China. And actually, since 2007...
Which is something, we don't always have this clear in mind.
Peak China in terms of the proportion of exporting was 2007, 13 years ago. That was the point at which China was actually more reliant on its exports than it was on its domestic market. That's a long time ago. So I think it's important to, again, keep some context. The headlines are interesting, but in truth, most of what gets made in China is for China. And therefore, actually, what this pandemic is doing is because of China being the only country that the IMF believes will grow this year, around 190 basis points, 1.9%, the relative growth in China will be much higher than the rest of the world, which just increases its needs to source and do what it does domestically. But the headline, again, doesn't fit with the actual facts.
Thank you for this. It's very interesting. In this period of high uncertainty, most of us, or at least a lot of us, dream of a more sustainable way of doing business, of a more sustainable world. And you advise your clients, often saying they need to think about long performance, they need to think long term. But let's say I run an airline company or a hotel. I'm really more concerned about, am I going to survive next quarter, than to think long term. So how can I, if I'm a business leader, how can I resist from the short term pressure under such uncertainty? And how do you help your clients to think long term, and why should they think long term?
Well, Fabrice, I think this is a very important topic. And at the beginning of the year, everybody was talking about the environment and the fact that we were not on a path to meet the 2015 Paris Climate Accords. We were falling short of the 1.5 to 2 degree pathway. Then the pandemic hit, and you're right, there was a shift in attention, a shift in focus away from the environment to the very immediate challenge we face. But actually, I think we're now shifting back to real attention on the environment for a few reasons that address your question. The first is, I think many of us would accept that there is a lot of learnings about the pandemic that apply to the environment. If you think about the pandemic, one of the things we've seen is systemic. It applies to the whole system. It's a physical risk. It creates real dislocation. It's something that occurred where what one country does impacts another country. And it fundamentally shook the business system. Day-to-day consumer confidence evaporated. People were worried about their health and their future. The environment is exactly the same. It will affect everything. It is a physical risk. We can already see that with the climate change effects on the west coast of America and the fires that are occurring, the flooding that's taking place in parts of Europe. So you look at that and you say, well, there's a lot of common realities. And the biggest reality is the problem with the pandemic is we weren't prepared. The issue with the environment is we can see this coming. We know it's coming. We know it's getting worse. We know it's a cumulative risk, as opposed to the pandemic, which was an immediate risk that occurred overnight. Now, in that context, I think what's happening is three things that are occurring that are making it, I think, a false choice between, do I trade off the short term for the long term? The first thing for large companies, and I accept this as large companies, is there's much more transparency occurring now around their contribution to the environment. And that's happening because of several things. One, common accounting standards. There are now standards being created that companies around the world are signing up and will, because of investor pressure or government regulation, need to accept, which makes it much more transparent what that airline does or what that hotel chain contributes towards the environment. So greater transparency brings greater scrutiny, which brings greater attention, which means people are a bit more motivated to act. The second thing is, oftentimes, the difference between an environmentally wise choice and one choice that is on fossil fuels and cheaper is that the near-term capital cost of putting in the electrical, for example, an electric vehicle, to buy the vehicle without government subsidy, it's more expensive. To run that vehicle is a lot cheaper. And therefore, somebody has to find a way to bridge the gap between the capital cost and the operating cost. We're in an era of unprecedented low interest rates. Capital costs have fallen dramatically. That shifts the equation. That really does shift the equation, and we've seen that. The capital investment required and how that economic cost looks is different. That's an impact, and that's allowing people to make greater investment. The third thing that's happening is a lot of the technologies we're talking about now are actually proven. They're not things we need to bring from the future. And so if you look at what's happened with solar, renewables, and some of the other investments that have been made, that access to the renewable technologies is increasing, and therefore the ability to do all that is helpful. The last part, the stimulus packages, the government interventions, they're putting a lot of the incentive on the side of a green recovery, not a brown recovery. And that's also a near-term reality, which is it's creating an opportunity. But more importantly, it's a recognition that oftentimes in our analysis, the economics of a green choice is better than a brown choice. And if you look at what that means in practical terms, whether it's utility costs or energy costs for vehicles and so on, you can find a way to say, look, it's actually it's less expensive to build back in a way that is more environmentally friendly. So all of that, I think, is working in favor. For a small business, though, I see the point. It's more challenging.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Time is running very fast. I think we have to, we are reaching the end of the session. I didn't want to leave you without asking a last question about another big event, I can say, which is the US election. You are based in New York. You have followed this very closely. What do you think the election of Joe Biden can mean for business? Does a president of the United States still have big power today, or are the big players people like you, CEOs, or can a US president have influence on business?
Well, I think business leaders have universally, I think, welcomed the fact that we look to be in a situation where at least it's remained peaceful. The vote has occurred. The American people have said what they think. Clearly, the courts and others are still involved, so it's not for me as a business person to try and opine on that. But I think what any business leader wants is a stable environment where you can understand how decisions are being made and that you can look forward to an ability to have a dialogue around those decisions. How that will be impacted by President-elect Biden, time will tell, but I think you can see from the commentary that's out there that most business leaders are just looking forward to a peaceful transition of power and an environment in which those dialogues can occur. But the notion that the US president doesn't have some influence in the business community, I think it's safe to say, of course, it's important. And as someone who's not a US voter, I've observed this with great interest. It's a very different system than the one we have back home. So I just watch it with great interest.
Okay, well, Kevin, I really thank you very much for sharing your views. I think even if sometimes the current atmosphere seems quite gloomy, there are some reasons for hope. Well, we have talked about the vaccines. We see how fast businesses are adapting, and you are helping them to adapt. So I think there is some reasons to keep our hopes high. And again, in the name of the Conference of Paris, I thank you very much, Kevin, and I hope that next year maybe we will meet for real in Paris.
I hope so.
Thank you
very much hope
everybody,
so.
And stay connected on the conference. Thank you to all. Thank you very much.